Good afternoon. I'm Lisa Mazie from Marquette University Law School, and I'm here today with Nancy Dowd. It's January 6th of 2018, and we're going to do Nancy's oral history today. Nancy is with the University of Florida Levin School of Law, and we'll start with the beginning, which is where were you born and what was it like growing up where you were?
Okay, well, I'm a Jersey girl, so I was born in East Orange, New Jersey, and lived in New Jersey until I went off to college. So initially in North Jersey, and till about 7th grade, and then in what's considered South Jersey, the beginning of the Jersey Shore, and went and was there until I graduated from high school.
Okay. Did you, what was your family like? Your mother, father, siblings?
I have, I'm the middle of three. So I have an older sister, a brother who's 10 years younger, and then my father remarried, and I had two step siblings, only one of whom is still alive. So my dad was an engineer, my mom and my stepmom both were homemakers.
Okay, so and growing up in those two places in New Jersey, did you go to public schools, private schools?
Public schools. Yeah, no, pretty, just I would call it a suburban or small town childhood. And when down in the Jersey Shore, of course, it was a much more water-oriented. We were near to the rivers in Sandy Hook Bay and the ocean, and that had a big influence and a sort of lifelong love of sailing for me.
Oh, okay.
But pretty, I would say, traditional middle-class upbringing with no particular expectations of me or my sister, but other than we were going to go off to college. But probably if you had said to me in high school, what will your life be like? It would have been an expectation of going to college, finding a husband, getting married, having children. Not particularly of imagining my life as anything of what it became.
Okay, so that leads to some very interesting questions. So when you were younger, and you said that there was an expectation that you and your sister would go to college, but was that in an era where usually young girls or girls did not go to college? And if it was, why was that more of an expectation for your family, you think, for your sister?
No, I think it was commonplace among, I think most of the girls that I went to high school with did go on to college or something. My sister, for example, went on to nursing school as opposed to going at a time when nurses were not degreed nurses. So, no, I think there was just, I grew up in an era where the help wanted ads were divided by gender, where jobs were divided by gender, and so certain things that I might have gotten interested in, I think I will be an X. The response of, well, girls don't do that, was not uncommon.
Right.
And I think my reaction was, well, if I want to do that, I'll do it, but it really was an era where the expectation of motherhood and as being primary, I think, was part of what I grew up with.
Right.
That changed when I got to college.
Okay, so in high school, you knew you were going to college, but what did you see yourself majoring in college?
Well, the two primary occupations for women were
Teaching and
teaching and to be a teacher or a secretary.
Okay.
So I did my one very practical, pragmatic course that I took in high school was touch typing, which I'm forever grateful for. So I went to college expecting that I would become a teacher.
Okay.
But not with a great passion for it. Again, with a just sort of, I think I was following in what was the societal expectations of my upbringing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So were you particularly active in any organizations or any sports or anything in high school or something?
Well, you have to remember there were no women's sports.
That's true. That's true.
Zero. Absolutely zero. So that was not an option. I think I played softball when I was in grammar school, but no women's sports in high school. I was an extremely active person in high school. I was a cheerleader. I did a lot of singing in choirs, choruses, and a girls' singing group. I was in the French club. I don't even remember. I was just a very, very busy high school student. Probably for most of my high school contemporaries, they would remember me as, one of the cheerleaders, because that, of course, was a big plum deal. And my sister and I were both on the cheerleading squad. So I was very actively engaged in things in high school. I was in a school where, so I went to a regional high school. And though we were not, there was obviously no official segregation. I think that my memory is of having a lot of friendships with across race lines, but there was again a very clear set of social rules that when I reflect back on it, that I think, how do we learn those things? I don't know of any. I'm sure there were some. Cross-race relationships. Parties were very single-race parties. So there was this closeness, and yet there were boundaries that everybody seemed to observe. So again, this was in a town called Red Bank. So I went to Red Bank High School, the Red Bank Buccaneers, class of '67. And, it was a great place to grow up. It was a wonderful place to grow up. I had strict parents. Never really got in any trouble. And then off I went to college in Connecticut.
Yeah, so I want to get to that, but before I do, I want to say, so you were going to go to college, you said, but you weren't, for teaching, but you weren't necessarily passionate about it, but it was what you were.
Well, I was a good student, and I loved school. So
well, that's what I was going to ask.
It wasn't that anyone forced me to go.
Right, but what were you passionate about? Was there any thing that you were really passionate about as a teenager?
I was very engaged in the activities of my high school.
Okay.
So I don't know that there was any one thing. I was incredibly active and busy throughout that period of my life. Yeah.
Okay, and then so you went to college in Connecticut.
Yeah.
Why there?
I probably wanted to get as far away from my parents as possible, but also my sister had gone to nursing school in New London, Connecticut. So I think Connecticut was as far away. No, well, probably not the only place. The place where I really my number one choice was William and Mary. Didn't get in there. And also my parents imposed, there were financial constraints on where I could choose to go. So, for example, a super expensive private university was not on the table. And I think that was, to some extent, gender-driven in the sense of you didn't invest that much in your daughter's education as you might have for a son. Or it may have been just my parents' decisions about resources. But my perception at the time was, here's the limit as to where you can go. So I was paying out-of-state tuition, obviously, leaving New Jersey. I didn't want to go to Rutgers. That was way too close. I wanted to go farther away.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so how was college then? You had mentioned earlier that things sort of changed in college. So what year did you enter, and what
Well, I graduated from high school in '67, and I graduated from college in '71.
Okay.
So I was there at a point when I probably went into college with a very what would I call it? A middle of the road, middle class orientation to life, and college was a life changing experience for me because the civil rights movement was something that was going on. Of course, it had been going on throughout the late '50s, throughout the '60s, but it was there that I became really engaged with issues of race, and that was probably my strongest shift in thinking, challenge to my thinking. I think I really benefited from going to college at a time where every single belief or principle that I had been raised with was challenged. So everything about my world and my values was challenged, and a part of that was due to the civil rights movement, a large part of it, and the other part was Vietnam. Mm-hmm. So and the anti-war movement. So it was a period of tremendous questioning, of activism, of a model of being engaged, and also I think a somewhat naive expectation that if you got enough people together, you can make the world change. Almost as if you could expect that the world was going to change on the spot. That all it took was a bringing of people together in sufficient numbers. And of course, there was some sense that in fact that's what happened. I mean, mm-hmm. you could see that movement. There was tremendous excitement, tremendous challenge, risk, all the kinds of things that adolescents and young adults like to do. Right. But it was a phenomenal time, and what is striking for me is I have a sister who is 2 years older, and we experienced that phase and that time completely differently. Because she was older, went through nursing school, didn't go to college, was on the other side of this and working, and so she, I think, philosophically, politically, remained in the stream that we had grown up in. Mm-hmm. And I was the crazy, rebellious child that my parents were afraid that I would be arrested, and that was their biggest fear.
So I was going to ask, so it sounds like you're becoming more active, more politically active, and mm-hmm. Your beliefs mm-hmm. are being challenged, and how did that play at home then?
Well, it didn't play well at home. I mean, actually, no. I mean, they thought this was terrible. I mean, when I think back to it now, I mean, it wasn't as if, they called up and said and ordered me to stop or threatened to withdraw my financial support or anything like that. It was clear it was not something that they were happy about. But timing-wise, so Kent State happened in my junior year, at the end of my junior year, and that galvanized actions on campus, and I think my parents were very concerned that was I going to be involved in the more. They were concerned that I would get arrested, that I'd get thrown out of school. So, but how it played at home was not a driving force for me. I mean, I was already in a part of my life where what I was experiencing was most important to me. Mm-hmm. So I think part of this was the last 2 summers that I was in, like the summer, I'm thinking between junior and senior year, and the summer after my senior year, I didn't go home in the summer. I worked at the university in various programs, so I wasn't going back into explaining this to my parents or feeling at all that I had to. I mean, this was not a period where all of this was about rebellion against those values and a rejection of those values. So the idea that you would simply do what your parents told you was not, it just wasn't part of it. So but the other side of it is being inside that period, and watching the dynamics within protest groups and strategy sessions and that kind of stuff. It wasn't all pretty and wonderful and fabulous. There were a lot of personalities, a lot of domination by certain people who wanted things to happen in a particular way. So it was very eye-opening in terms of that, as well as eye-opening in terms of, for me, it meant if you wanted real change to happen, then you had to be committed over the long haul. That if you thought, oh, I'm going to make everything change by showing up to a series of demonstrations and then the whole world's going to change, and if it doesn't, then I'm going to walk away from this.
Right.
I think there was a significant part of my generation that just walked away from it, that just said, okay, I guess that didn't work, instead of sticking with it and doing the often hard work
Right.
of making change happen. So, but it was a just phenomenal time to be leaving home and still be financially supported by my parents, and at the same time have this just complete breath of fresh air. And I think I don't know that there's been anything else quite like it, in the sense that I think it very much molded me for the rest of my life, and I think college should be a time of great challenge. Right. And so if you haven't been pressed on how you grew up or what your circumstances are, what your beliefs are, then you may not have an opportunity to examine them and think
Right.
about them. So I feel like I was very blessed to grow up when I did.
So you were an activist, and did that change what you wanted to do in college, what you wanted to major in, what you saw yourself doing after it?
No, because at that point, so I went in, I ended up being a history major and English minor. I started off as an education major, and then very quickly realized that I found the education classes boring, but I love my English classes and I love my history classes. So I figured I'm going to do what I love, and then I'll get a certification at the end and I'll teach, instead of going and teaching education classes, which I found not particularly to my taste. In my junior year, I took a course in Asian history and became fascinated. And then had a very supportive mentor. And the end result of that was I took what classes were available at UConn in Chinese history, and then applied to go to graduate school.
Okay, and your mentor was it a female professor or a male professor?
Male.
Okay, and
I'm trying to think if I had, and I can't, there are no memorable female professors from my undergraduate days.
Did that stand out to you at that time, or was that just
No.
sort of like, yeah, that's just
the way it was.
Just the way it was.
Yeah.
So then you became fascinated with Chinese history. You went to graduate school at UConn, or
No, at the University of Illinois.
at the University of Illinois. Okay,
Yeah.
and so tell me about that time.
Well, I chose Illinois because that was where my mentor had studied, and there were probably only a dozen graduate history grad departments in the country that offered a Chinese history major. So with his encouragement and support, I applied to that program, got a fellowship that covered my all my expenses, because at that time the federal government was encouraging American students to learn a non-traditional language. So Russian and Chinese, and probably Japanese were all. And I went to graduate school and took intensive Chinese over 2 years till I finished my master's. And that was so in terms. So what I imagined was that I would, by that time, it was like, I love this, I'm going to pursue this, get my PhD, and I will become a history professor. That's what I'm going to do.
So teaching, but not maybe at the level your parents sort of envisioned for you.
Well, again, at this point, my parents had long since not been that was not, they were not directing my life. I was directing my life, and that's part of, I think I probably always felt that I was in charge of my life, not that my parents were going to tell me what to do. I think my expectations and my identification of what I wanted to do changed. The Chinese history fascinated me, completely fascinated me, and part of that was a fascination with the Chinese revolutionary process. That fascinated me, but also the long course. It's a very, very fascinating civilization. So it was just keep doing something that you love doing, and it will all work out in terms of finishing a PhD, getting a position teaching, which did not happen. So I mean, I'm an ABD. I did my orals. I finished my master's degree, did all my coursework, did my orals for my PhD, had my thesis identified. When I went off to graduate school, the first week I was there, I met another student who I lived with and eventually married, and he was going to do Chinese archaeology, and I was doing Chinese history. Partway through, he decided that what he had really always wanted to do was be a doctor. Even though, at that point in time, if you were over 25, you were not admitted to med school because you were considered to be too old. And he was then, I think, 28. But with the encouragement of the faculty, and this is telling his department, this is what I really want to do, and they were supportive. So because he had to pick up, I don't know, biology and chemistry, and I can't remember what else, so that he could even apply. And talked to somebody who said, oh, apply to this program at Loyola Chicago. They had a 3-year med school program instead of a 4-year. And I think the thought was, well, maybe because it's a shorter program, they'll make an exception even though you're old. And they accepted him. Fine. So we moved up to Chicago. I got a job. Maybe I had an assistantship for a while, but I finally backed out of my PhD program because there were no jobs. So everyone had said to me, this is great. This is when Nixon had gone to China. Wow, you hit this right at the right time, blah, blah, blah. But the academic world didn't catch up with that until probably 20 years later. So there were a handful of jobs around the country. And it would have meant, there was either no job, a very long, it was 7 to 10 years for people to get their thesis done because it was so hard to get to resources. I was really unhappy with the classic thesis requirement of looking at how many angels were on the head of a pin.
Yeah.
But I was confronted with there was not going to be a job for me at the end. I was going to spend all this time and it was not going to go anywhere. So with considerable reluctance, I stopped, and so I was working, doing all kinds of crazy but interesting jobs, just to pay the rent until I figured out what else I was going to do.
So what kind of jobs did you do?
I worked for a magazine on their editorial board. I watered plants. But probably the job that led me to law school was I worked for the police department in Oak Park, Illinois, which I couldn't believe I was doing since I had all this protest. This is like working for the pigs, I mean, how could I do this? But I needed to pay the rent.
Right, because your husband was in medical school.
Because he was in medical school. He had a tuition scholarship, but we needed to pay living expenses. So, and there was a job as a community service officer for the police department. So I did that for about a year, and then a job opened as a dispatcher. So I did that. And both of those were really interesting jobs, but the most interesting part of that job was being on the inside, on the other side of a police force, and just talking to cops, and also interfacing at times, because the holding cell for the police department was right next to where the dispatchers were. So occasionally they would bring in these truly horrible, I mean nasty, terrible people, and you kind of got a different perspective. Not that everybody who's arrested is nasty and terrible, but
Right.
And got to know the cops and the ups and downs of their job, and many cops are limited purpose lawyers. So I finally decided, I think in part because of that experience, to go to law school. So my decision to go to law school was a completely pragmatic, okay, I'm going to go back to school. I'm going to do this. I can get a job at the end. I don't want to go back and do, otherwise I'm not sure how it would have all played out if I hadn't gone to law school, but it was really not through a passion for the law. There was a little bit of it that probably was, okay, maybe I can put my whole civil rights and protest background to work by becoming a lawyer and being able in some way to work on that agenda again. But certainly with no expectation of teaching, and not even a strong, oh wow, I really want to be a lawyer. It was like, no, I really want a job where I'm got to make,
Make some money.
Make some money.
Right. So, and your husband was still in medical school when you decided this, and then so that clearly, I would imagine, limited your scope of where you would apply.
Right. I applied in Chicago. I'm trying to think if I applied anywhere outside of Chicago. He was approaching his. No, I applied in several parts of the country because he was approaching his internship and residency part of his career, because he was finishing med school. And so he was going through the match. And so he was picking out programs where he might want to be, and I was looking at law schools so that I could see where I could go. And he ended up taking a program in Chicago. So.
Okay.
So I had gotten into Loyola Chicago, and I can't even remember anymore where else I got in when I applied. But anyway, so I made that decision, and during my first year of law school, we got divorced, so I was free to go somewhere else and almost transferred, but was persuaded by a faculty member that I'd do better if I stayed where I was.
So, how many years? So, when you entered law school, how many years out of undergrad were you? Because you were then not the typical, if you will.
Right. Well, so I was just turning 30 as I started law school.
Okay, so quite a few years out of undergrad.
Yep.
And were there a lot of women in your class when you started? You started, I believe, in the late 70s, did you?
Well, I graduated in 81, so yeah, late 70s. I think I was surprised by the number of women in my class. They were about a quarter of my class. And there were a number of female faculty at my law school. I was surprised by that too. In my first year classes, I had my crim law and torts professors were both women, property, civ pro, con law, all men.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you feel like your experience in law school then was a little different, given that you were an older student and or female?
I wasn't. There was a chunk of women in my class who were even older, who were probably mid to late 30s. I didn't feel that much older. There was a substantial number of students who had spent at least a year or two or three out of school before they went to law school. So I don't think I felt a real age separation. What I did feel like was that my experience in grad school meant that I came into law school already having an experience of critical thinking and critical writing. I mean, I had been a research assistant to one of my professors and therefore had taught sections and realized I really enjoyed teaching. So in that sense, I think it was easier for me. It was a little, at the same time, I had no expectation that I would do well. I just figured, well, I've been out for a while, I'll come back in here as everybody who's really well prepared and smart, and we'll see how I do. I tell my law students now, I said, we had year-long courses, and at the practice exams early in my first semester, I got D's and F's on every single one, because I wasn't really paying attention, or I didn't really understand, I guess, what this idea of arguing both sides of an issue.
Right.
I was looking for the answer.
Right.
Because I was used to, as a history student, being given sort of a set of information, and then you would write an interpretation. So you did take a position rather than trying to be dispassionate. So I was that, I got it. When I got this quiz, I'm like, what was that again? And then did very well at the end of my first year, to my great surprise, and as is still typical, that was a setup for me for the rest of law school, because it qualified me for law review, and that put me in. Well, the other thing is that at least one professor that I had, he and I were probably no more than 3 years apart in age. So I had close relationships with several professors. I had, and at the end of my second year, maybe? No, at the end of my, anyway, I think maybe either between first and second or second and third, I had a faculty member ask me if I was interested in teaching. And I'm like, well, I don't know how do you become a law professor. I had absolutely no clue. And so I had someone mentor me in well, here's the pathway.
Right.
Here's the pathway. The pathway is law review, write an article, get a clerkship, into law teaching. That was
right.
the clear way in at that point in time. So, that was luck, real luck that happened for me.
So between when you entered and that moment, so after your first year, you did really well, and did that, and I know institutionally that when you do really well, yes, it opens some of those doors, and also sort of institutionally suggests that the successful lawyer or law student is going to be the one who's going to get themselves prepped for that large firm job or law teaching.
Right.
So did you at first said you didn't really think of yourself as wanting to be a lawyer, really, you just wanted to get a job.
Right.
So as law school first year was ending, what were you thinking? And surprising yourself, you did well.
Yeah.
Before that conversation with the particular professor, what did you think now maybe what does my future look like?
I don't think I had a real definite, I'm going to be a this or that. Again, coming into law school, I was going to do the training and get a job.
Right.
That's all it was. And I don't think I even had thought far enough ahead to, am I going to stay in Chicago? Am I going to go back east? Because I came in married. I was divorced by the time I was halfway through my first year.
Right.
That was the focus of my emotions and my thinking that year. The fact that, and thank God I had law school to keep me distracted from that. So I don't know that I had any clear plan other than, again, I was working while I was in law school. I almost dropped out my first week when my husband said I want a divorce, because I was like, how the heck am I going to go to school? Because the idea was I had supported him, now he would support me.
Right.
So I had to go in and ask my dean for, can I get a loan? How can I get a loan? Mm-hmm. It was not easy to maneuver that. So I had to figure out how to stay in school, how to pay my tuition, and how was I going to support myself, and where was I going to live, and all of the stuff involved in a divorce from somebody who had nothing. My husband had nothing. Mm-hmm. It was not like, oh great, give me some assets so I can do this. So I think what I was going to do at the end was not my focus. I don't think it was like, I don't know, I'll do something.
Right.
It was probably not until, it probably was between my second and third year. I'm trying to remember I know, I was a research assistant for a professor in my first summer. And then I worked for a firm my second summer and my third summer, a large law firm sitting in Austin. So I was doing well enough that I could get this plum job because I needed the money.
Right.
Hadn't thought any farther than that. Just figured I would get a job, some job, until I had someone say, well, why don't you consider a clerkship, and this might be your way into teaching.
Mm-hmm. And then you obviously made law review, and did you get a clerkship then?
Yes, because I also was selected and was the editor-in-chief of my law review. Okay. So I did that. I clerked on the Seventh Circuit.
Okay.
And before that clerkship started, I had an interview with Justice Stevens, although did not get a Supreme Court clerkship. But that was, for my law school, I think the first time anyone had ever gotten that far in that process.
Had you applied was that your own, I think I'll apply to Justice Stevens, or did...
No, I applied to all of the Supreme Court justices, as I think was typical for anybody who had a Court of Appeals clerkships, and maybe even for a district court, but typically Court of Appeals. Again, someone mentored me that, hey, you might as well, this would be something, and you applied. So I had my Seventh Circuit clerkship before I started my last year of law school, and then was encouraged to apply for the Supreme Court, which you did that during my senior year, and then the interviews for that were the summer before I started my clerkship.
Oh, okay.
So you knew before you were starting your clerkship whether you were
going to go on or not.
Right.
So when you were clerking at the Seventh Circuit, who did you clerk for?
Judge Sprecher, Robert Sprecher.
Okay, and were you the only woman law clerk, or one of few, or how were?
In his chambers, there were 3 clerks, two men, 1 woman. As far as the configuration of clerks at that time, I mean, there were several women.
Okay, so this wasn't, you weren't feeling like you were breaking barriers or anything. It was just
No,
gender-wise.
I think that, well, there had been a prior law clerk to Judge Sprecher, also a woman, also who went on into law teaching. And so he had certainly had female clerks before. But the more judges then, and I think now, tend to pull from certain law schools.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of his clerks was from Yale, one was from Northwestern. So Loyola wasn't a feeder school for him, but I think my application was presented to him by my references as, this is a person like the Loyola law clerk
Mm-hmm.
that you had 6 years ago.
Right.
Outstanding like that person, you know, so I went in and I had an interview and I was selected. There were a number of, I'm trying to think, at least 1 or 2 of the clerks that were in the Seventh Circuit at the same time as I went into law teaching. There was no feeling that as female clerks we were breaking ground. I mean, we function in a world where certainly if a quarter of your class is women, you don't tend to. Maybe that was like that's what it was. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
You didn't. You know, we weren't. I never had any sense of. I mean, like I've heard stories about what things were like at the University of Florida in an earlier era of how much women were discouraged from being there, and it was communicated that they were taking a man's place and they didn't belong there and that kind of stuff. I never experienced that in law school. Okay. But I attribute that to, I don't know, I was in a big city and there were a lot of women entering the law profession at that point in time. I mean, the late 70s, early 80s, you know, there was quite an influx of women. So I don't think we thought of it, any of us thought of it as, oh, we were doing this great groundbreaking thing. There was just enough of a critical mass. Mm-hmm. And certainly clerking, none of us thought of it. The person who got the clerking position with Justice Stevens was a woman. Mm-hmm. I don't think he had. I think there were other justices whose record was strongly gendered male,
right,
but not him. So,
okay.
Yeah, that was again, a very strong, wonderful memory. There was much more for me. So my second summer, I clerked at a Boston firm, an old Boston firm.
Because you wanted to go back east? Or
yes,
because,
I was going to go back east.
Okay.
And I'll just say, and there, I think the reaction to the news that I was going to have this interview was to suddenly elevate my stature, mm-hmm. because I had come from a non-Ivy League school, mm-hmm. which was a very interesting piece to kind of live through.
Yeah.
No, I think that the clerkship was phenomenal. As most people say, it's a phenomenal experience. And right. My judge died during the clerkship. I went into the hospital, caught something in the hospital. Mm. So halfway through my clerkship, he died. All the clerks stayed on, and we were kind of taken on by the rest of the judges on the Seventh Circuit. You know, they did various things to take over Judge Sprecher's cases. So that was very interesting because Judge Posner, for example, had just come on the bench, mm-hmm. then. And then there was like Judge Swigert, who had been on forever, yeah. and every personality in between. So we had a kind of a unique clerking experience, right. But they were very supportive of all of us, and because there were cases where, for example, if the panel that Judge Sprecher was on was all in agreement, and if the opinion had been assigned to him and he hadn't written it at the time that he died, then another judge would take it over. There wouldn't then be a basis for the litigants to require a re-argument. If his vote was determinative, then they often would allow them the opportunity of a re-argument. So, yeah. And the big AT&T MCI case happened while I was there, so we got to see a full courtroom of every, large firm lawyer in Chicago.
Right.
That was quite an experience. A huge redistricting case happened while I was there. So,
Right.
yeah, it was great.
So after that, then what you applied for, but you had earlier applied for, but did not get the Supreme Court clerkship.
Right.
So when you were clerking, then what were you thinking? So now you got to move into teaching, right? That's the path.
Well, my thought was, I knew that I could go right into teaching, and I did actually some teaching interviews at that point, but I didn't know if I might want to practice. And so I thought that typically you don't want to start teaching and then try to go back to practice. You need to go the other way around.
Right.
So my thought was, okay, I'm going to go practice and then decide what I want to do. So I went back to the firm that I worked for in Boston, which, I had offers from the two firms I'd worked for my 2 summers, but I did not want to stay in Chicago.
Right.
Because I had been there because of grad school and then my marriage, and I really wanted to go back east.
Right.
So I headed back east, and probably, within 6-9 months of my first year of practice, said, this is definitely not for me.
And what were you doing? What kind of practice were you doing there?
Labor and employment law.
Okay.
Yeah, which was very, very interesting in terms of, that's probably where I hit you're a lady lawyer.
So you heard different kinds of, or you had different kinds of experiences in private practice being female.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
From
Absolutely.
judges, from other lawyers, from clients?
Less from judges, because I was in a big firm, which meant you're rarely in the courtroom.
Right.
But yeah, it was very blatant, certainly, and I think everything was, I think the standard approach was to try and conform as much to a male standard as possible, whether it was dress or but it was just there, and in the labor field, if you were doing any traditional employer union stuff, like we had a client that went on strike, and so so I was on site while that strike was going on, and so they're just funny interactions. I felt very well supported by the senior people that I worked with, but again, I pretty quickly knew it was like I really loved it for about 6 months, and then gradually I realized this is not for me, and would have thrown my hat in the following year. Come to AALS, done all that, and at that point, this is, if you had the resume that I had, I would have gotten a teaching job. I wouldn't have known where, and I was certainly willing to do go somewhere else. I wasn't feeling like I needed to stay in the Northeast or anything like that. But I had a friend who was in the LLM program at Harvard, and who had practiced for a long time. In fact, she and I had known each other at Sidley and Austin, and she wanted to go into teaching. So she came to get an LLM and use that that was going to be her route in. And who called me one day because she knew that I had decided, yeah, I think I'm going to go for teaching, and she said, and so this was in the spring, outside the normal fall hiring, and said there's an opening at Suffolk Law School. You might want to. I heard that through the grapevine here, and I actually don't remember whether it was a retirement or a death. They are casting about trying to hire somebody before the normal process because they need someone to teach for next year. So I sent them a resume. It happened that I had written a law review article that first year that I was practicing because of a case that I handled on the distinction between independent contractors and employees under Title VII. And so, and it was published in William and Mary. So without really understanding it at the time, it was like, I had this very well-placed law review article that I'm walking into this interview with at a school that at that point there wasn't, I think a strong scholarship commitment. And I had these other great credentials and they offered me a job. So I made that step into teaching at that point.
What did they have you teach?
Contracts.
Okay.
That's what they had me teach: contracts, employment discrimination, and labor law. And my labor and employment stuff was very strongly informed by what I had done in practice. So it made my teaching, it meant that I organized my teaching not only around principles and cases and that sort of thing, but like I'd have my students draft a complaint, or I would have them do something that connected what they were learning to real practice and to thinking through things the way real lawyers did.
Right.
So the practice experience was actually really terrific for me. So I probably did a full year and a half or maybe 2 years of practice before I left, and it had a real strong influence on my teaching, particularly in the first decade that I taught. And I still remember walking around the law firm and telling people I was leaving, and there were so many people who were like, "Oh, I wish I could be doing what you're doing."
Yeah.
So yeah, it worked out great for me, because I was staying in Boston too, which I had not anticipated I would be able to do.
Right, and you were happy about that.
Yeah. I loved being there. And the other super benefit was sometime in my first year of teaching, I think, a colleague, so Suffolk then had probably a tenure-track faculty, 65, 70 faculty. It's a big law school, as big as BU. And Harvard. So there were these three huge law schools in Boston. And one of the women on my faculty handed me information about the FemCrits, which I knew zero about feminist theory. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll go check this out. I was still new in what I was doing. And that was a defining moment in my in my career as a law teacher was that experience. So I was in Boston for 6 years, and that opened up a whole new intellectual and professional set of pathways for me, and had as much of an impact on my thinking as my civil rights and anti-war experiences in college.
Right, and that was in your beginning part of teaching there? Okay. Did you get tenure at Suffolk? And
No, what happened was in my, what would have been my tenure year, I was offered a visiting position at the University of Florida and at that particular moment in my personal life, I was in the process of adopting my first child as a single parent.
mm-hmm.
And so I said, well, I'll come, but only if I can come for a year, because a semester will be too disruptive. And I just figured this will be great, because as a visitor, you would not have administrative or
Right.
committee responsibilities. And so I thought, well, it sounds kind of stupid in retrospect, because I was also leaving my support system, but I was thinking, it'll be a less demanding job for the first year of this child's life. I won't have to go through winter with a newborn. I think this is a good idea,
Yeah.
So, and then I'll come back to Boston.
Right.
I was going up for tenure that year, and I said to them, okay, I have this opportunity. And Suffolk said, well, we're not going to do your tenure while you're gone. We'll do it when you get back. And I'm like, okay. I mean, I wasn't worried. I was publishing what probably within there would have been considered this fairly radical stuff, but they all liked me. And I mean, I was a good teacher and good on committees, and I felt really clear that there was no doubt I was going to get tenure. My publication record was strong, probably stronger than most, and I was without this sounding too boastful, I was a big fish in a smaller pond,
right.
Only because they, at that point, had a lot of faculty who were practicing as well as teaching. They thought of themselves as a very practice-oriented, pragmatic law school. And so their dedication to scholarship was not strong. Yeah. There were people on the faculty who were strong scholars, Karen Blum being one of them. So anyway, I was fine with them. And
so let me just, so what you said, what you were publishing was kind of radical, but they liked you, you were saying. What were you publishing at that time that?
Well, I have been really, I was just strongly influenced by my experience with the FemCrits. So
right.
that, so then I was playing catch up, reading feminist theory, reading the CLS classics. This was right at sort of just before critical race kind of broke out as its own separate piece. So I was open to a theoretical framework that it was like, oh wow, yeah, of course. So my publishing then was mostly in the employment discrimination area. And I had a very dear friend go through having a baby her first year in practice in Chicago. So I wrote about work-family issues for a number of years. And so that put me squarely into understanding and using feminist theory at a point where a lot of scholarship was very doctrinal.
Right.
Let's gather all these cases about this particular area, and this is what they say, and here's my recommendation about a narrow, like my very first piece
right.
that I wrote before I was hired on, well, what should the test be for employee status under Title VII? Very
right.
doctrinal, very
right.
middle of the road, very,
and
nobody's feathers get ruffled. So I mean, this was an era of tremendous intellectual, again, challenge and growth to the academy in general.
Right.
And for me, also on a personal level, I happen to be at a place where it's kind of like, well, it's kind of like, well, we don't know about all that, but we know you,
Yeah.
and you're okay. So yeah, whatever. It's
Okay,
fine.
so you weren't worried that they might have thought that that isn't real scholarship. It's kind of
No,
okay. So all right. So then
because I got my promotion from assistant to associate professor.
okay.
I'm heading up to tenure. I have every piece of feedback saying I'm doing fine, and I'm like, I'm just gonna go do this visit,
Right.
and then I'll come back. They knew that I was in the process of doing an adoption, so I think they also understood. Hey, this you know, it's a win-win for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And so the surprise was that I went and I didn't come back.
Mm.
Yeah.
So you-
And so what happened in terms of my tenure was that, I mean, I can't off the top of my head remember how much I published by that time, but enough. And I went down to Florida, and I'm not making any effort to turn this into a permanent job. I'm just there.
Right.
And in the fall of that first semester, the associate dean came to me and said, would you consider coming permanently? And I said, I don't know, maybe. It depends on what you would offer me.
Mm-hmm.
So they decided, he said, well, you know, at this point we need to do a tenure evaluation as well as a hiring evaluation. Who can we contact that would know your work? It's like November now, and they're gonna make a decision in December or January. And so I knew enough people. Again, I had been coming to AALS, I'm going to the Film Crits, I'm being invited to conferences and giving papers. So I knew enough people at that point to say, well, probably here are the people that I think probably could have read my work, so you don't have to ask them out of the blue to read it.
Right.
And some wonderful people. For example, in that time frame, I met Martha Feynman when she was at Wisconsin. And she is one of those incredible nurturers of talent, and nurtured and mentored me at that point in time. So that meant I could say, oh, well, for example, you could ask Martha Feynman if she'll write a tenure letter for me. And gosh, I can't even remember who else, but I could give them some big names, right?
Right.
So they all wrote letters, and so the dean at the time said, and they said to me, okay, now Florida has this crazy rule where you have to be here for a year before they'll put you up for tenure. And I said, well, I'm fine with that as long as the law school
Yeah.
does it. I said, I don't want to, I know I'm going to get tenure at Suffolk.
Yeah.
I don't want to come here and be on pins and needles for a year.
Right.
So you all know me well enough. My scholarship is going to be the same. You just at least make the tenure decision at the law school. And they had never had a decision not followed at the university. So I figured I was willing to take the risk of that. And then, you know, what else are you going to come up with? What are going to be the terms and conditions?
Right.
So the surprise was that when the offer was made, the dean said, you know, we'd like to offer you a job. You know, faculty has voted to hire you, and I can offer it to you with tenure, immediate tenure. I'm like, get out. So I always tell people I had the shortest tenure
Tenure, yeah, that's
anxiety of anybody I've ever heard of, and you know, so that was wonderful. It was my expectation was I would be at Florida for a couple of years and then I'd come back to the Northeast. But Florida had a lot to offer. It had some real, you know, it was in terms of gender, was the far less women on the faculty. Was, you know, had a reputation for not being a particularly supportive place for women, and you know, some people said to me, sure you want to go there?
Yeah.
And I just figured, yeah, I'm just going to be here for a few years. What the heck? And in terms of, it was such a giant step in the grand hierarchies of law schools that I thought, that might be really great. And no winter while I had this young child, so, and cheap. Oh my God, compared to living in Boston, it was like, wow, this is heavenly. And I thought, yeah, what the heck, I could do this for a couple of years. So, I don't think I ever thought, oh, I won't go back.
Right.
I just thought I'd go back, and then it didn't happen.
Right. And then did you find your experience, obviously, but did the early time at University of Florida, did it live up to the things that people warned you about, or was it?
Oh, I think my favorite is an unnamed faculty member who's kind of known for being a bit of a jerk. Walked in after because I was already there. Now, if they want to hire a visitor, you have to come, leave, and then they'll vote on you.
Right.
So that there wouldn't be any awkwardness. And this guy walks into my office and shakes my hand and says, "Well, I didn't vote for you, but welcome. Thanks for sharing." And when I asked somebody, so why did he not vote for me? Well, because you don't write real law review articles. You're like a sociologist. I'm like, yeah, well, that's your version of what an article ought to be.
Right.
And once you're tenured, it's like, okay, guys, too bad if you don't like this. I mean, I figured if what I was writing was a problem, they just wouldn't hire me. Mm-hmm. They'd find some reason. It's really easy not to hire somebody, as you know.
Right.
So that was neat. There were, yes and no. We had the faculty was top heavy with older white males at the time that I came on. And they were representatives of their generation, Mm-hmm. So when I was hired, I came on with 5 other people. There were 6 of us total, and that included 3 women, 1 African American, 1 Latino, and a Jew. It was like dropping a bomb in that place, and it wasn't just a gender bomb. It was a gender, race, religion, you name it, bomb.
Yeah.
And I don't know if deliberately or not, so the first year sections are 2 sections, all right. 1 section has, so they must have had 5 faculty, had 5 of the 6 of us. And the other section had the dinosaurs. So these 2 groups of students are comparing, like, what did you do in contracts today, or torts, or whatever? And it's like, we were all mostly kind of progressive scholars who didn't believe in the old school, beat 'em up style of teaching, and so we were kinder, gentler professors. We were younger, and we were lively, and so I think the fact that it wasn't just me. There was this infusion. Mm-hmm. But things like, when I first came as a visitor, I taught contracts.
Right. And then when you were full-time.
And they were looking at me like I was an alien from outer space, because there was no other woman teaching in the first year.
Oh, okay.
And I just thought, well, if you have a problem, that's your problem, not my problem. Yeah. I already dealt with some of that one at Suffolk, was with and just, and that, I think, early on was my attitude about a lot of this, was after being scared to death at the new law professors conference by the women who had taught in the just before me of like, oh, here's all the horrible things that are going to happen. I'm like, oh, crap. It really was fine. And I thought, it's their problem. It's not my problem. I'm just going to stand and do my job.
Do your thing.
And you got to get over it. If you can, you have to learn something from me. So yes, some of it was definitely there. I mean, I taught a gender in the law class starting my second or third year. Oh my God, it was like a bombshell. And then that became normalized,
Right.
and no big deal. Or did the men listen to the women? No. But they didn't listen to the black faculty either. They
Right.
treated them probably worse. And there was over time a coalition of progressive folks, and that started to shift policies on the law school.
Right.
And so it changed. It changed over time. And a push to hire, more diversity, gender, and race. So it worked itself out. I think at the beginning, Florida was behind the national curve, and over time it caught up, and of course the dinosaurs retired,
Yeah.
and that changed everything.
Right.
Yeah. Now I'm a dinosaur.
I wouldn't say that. Unbelievably, we're almost out of time. So I
Okay.
do want to ask you one question before we go, and that is, if you had any advice to give up-and-coming women in law, and either in law practice or in legal academic setting, what would you say? What advice would you
The
give?
typical advice that I give my students is my family has meant a great deal to me, and I've done family in a very unconventional way. And I often let them know that, so if they want to consider that too, because I adopted 2 children on my own. I think that family is incredibly important, and if they want to have a family, there are ways to figure out how to do that. So that's no work, no matter how good, and I think being a law professor is about as good as work as you can get, is worth giving up that part of your life if that's what you want. I'm not saying everybody wants to have children, but for me, I wouldn't give that up for anything. I think that also that being yourself and standing up for yourself is extremely important. And I don't think there's anything they can't do or can't make it be the way they want it to be. So I've watched some of my finest female students, and some males as well, who would say, well, like I've had men who are divorced and have little children, and it's like, well, you need to bring this up in your interviews and talk about the time that you want to have with your children, even if you risk not getting some jobs because you don't want those jobs.
Right.
So it's to take the risk and to, when I think of how much things have changed in my lifetime, how my life is not remotely the way I thought it was going to be. And it's still changing now in terms of my personal life and my professional life. So part of that is just go for what you love and it will work out, instead of trying to make yourself be something that the world thinks is acceptable. So I think I've been tremendously lucky and in that respect. But then the other side of it is if you're good at it, like if you're doing some, you know, if you've got some crazy idea or crazy project that you want to do, like this phenomenal project, and if somebody said, oh, well, I don't know, that's a very good thing for you to be spending your time in. Like, if you want to do it, just do it. Just do it. And that's the beauty of what we do, is that we can constantly remake ourselves. So I think that is what I just think there are things that really matter other than our work, and they can be integrated into our lives, and that will be what matters the most in the end.
Right.
You know, not going to matter how many students we taught or how many books we wrote. It's going to matter how good we were to the people that we love and care about. So that's what I would tell them.
Well, thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much for sharing your story.